It's American Pageant, Chapter 16, Mr. Shea for Notre Dame High School. Okay, we pick up in the antebellum period, and in order to understand this period, it's important to understand the economics that led the United States eventually into civil war, where really the two sides were fighting, yes, to preserve the Union, but clearly at the heart of the debate and the hatred between the two was the issue of slavery. It starts with cotton, and had the cotton gin by Eli Whitney, not been invented or invented later, it's possible that natural economic forces, along with a growing idea that slavery, the immorality of slavery, even in the South, that slavery might have died out. However, with the cotton gin and the availability now of a method to produce so much cotton at a reasonable rate, and the dependence that a dependence on slaves that evolved from this system, it was clear that slavery was here to stay. So, cotton becomes the number one export in the United States. It becomes the number one crop and accounts for as you can see in these upcoming slides, accounts for a significant percentage of the national economy, not just in the South, but also in the North, where northern textile mills are taking the cotton and the textile mills are spinning it into fabrics and selling these manufactured goods back into the South, or exporting them and selling them in the North to a growing population. England itself depended on cotton a great deal from the South as well. I'm sorry, I'm jumping ahead there. Um, as their economy, really, when you look at a significant percentage of it, derived its profits and revenue from the cotton industry, and most of the world's cotton, or a significant percentage of the world's cotton, came from the South. So, with all that being true, the Southern aristocracy, the Southern leadership, believed that cotton was king, and that slavery would be protected as a result, because if the North ever did move to remove slavery, and if civil war ever did come, because of England's dependency on the Southern crop, they believed that England would assist and aid, or ally themselves with the South to avoid economic recession in their own country. So, who benefited from cotton specifically in the South? The planter aristocracy, which you could see here in 1850, 1,733 families owned more than 100 slaves. So, that's not a very large number. Clearly, there's a lot more Southerners that did not own 100 slaves. These individuals were a very select group, extremely wealthy, and owned enormous parcels of land, were able to educate their children in private schools. You can see at the bottom here, John C. Calhoun at Yale, Jefferson Davis at West Point. So they had the ability to prosper and live a life of luxury that was not normal, the common life in the South, as sometimes we think it might have been. But for them, it was a very aristocratic society. They looked to establish a society on the models of, if you want to think of like old European models with nobles and servants and things like that. So that was their aim. Clearly, with this system, there was a huge divide between the rich and the poor. The planter aristocracy benefited greatly from the southern crop. However, your other farmers in the South struggled a great deal. Although some were slave owning, which we're going to talk about in a second here, they were not able to amass anywhere close to the type of wealth that this very few select group was able to do. So there's a huge gap. And why is that important? Well, There's no move to modernize manufacturing in the South. There's an enormous stunting of growth. Public education in the South never becomes a priority because those who would need to push for education could afford to send their sons and daughters, even, although mainly sons at this time, to private schools. So there's no push for public education. Women are the center of the Southern household, and they build their own staffs, and usually made up of slaves, servants. The women would even have slaves help raise their kids when you're talking about household slaves. So that was their main focus when we look at women in the South and what were their roles. Just a couple of photos here, you get an idea of what a plantation might look like. All right. So, what was plantation life actually like? It's hard to say or give one definitive answer because it varied depending on where the slaves lived, what area they were in. A slave in Mississippi had a very different life than a slave in Virginia, for example. But as time goes on, and cotton is the type of crop that really uh, destroys the soil and makes the soil untenable for quite a long time. So there is a move westward to the northwest, and mainly made by your smaller farmers who are selling their land to the larger planter aristocracy. So while the planter aristocracy gets bigger, the smaller farmers are reduced in number significantly during this time. With the slavery system, there became, there was certain uncertainties. Clearly, if your slaves were to get sick, your book talks about a lightning strike that unfortunately killed over 20 slaves at one time. The dependence on one single crop, like any investment portfolio, slavery, it's a speculative business. You have to do well. Prices have to be stable, for your single crop. Your slaves have to remain healthy. You can't have a bad season, growing season. Weather is a factor. So all these elements make it a very speculative business. Well, when you're speculating or investing, I'm sure a lot of you have already heard of this term. You would like to diversify so that if something doesn't work out in your investment, you have investments in other areas that will pick up or at least compensate for the losses you might experience. With cotton, and this was not the case. Most planters put all of their resources into just growing cotton. So this really created not only a dangerous economy for southern planters, but also an enormous resentment to the idea of eliminating slavery, taking the labor force away from them that they required in order to grow this single crop. So their dependence on one single crop also made them more ardent defenders of the institution of slavery. Southern planters also resented Northerners beyond, we're going to get into the abolitionist movement, but even before that, they resented the idea that the Northerners prospered a great deal off the backs of the Southerners and the slavery system. As the northern manufacturing system continued to grow, it grew very, very much economically, while the South, really did not keep pace. Initially with cotton, yes, but it slowed down quite a bit, and the North continued to grow, and Southern planters resented the North for that. When you think about immigration to the United States during this time, you think of the Irish and the Germans, especially in the mid 19th century. It's pretty obvious why most did not immigrate to the southern states. The idea of trying to compete for jobs with poor white farmers, and clearly you're not going to compete with jobs from slaves, made moving to those areas unappealing to the immigrants. As a result, the population growth in the United States during the 19th century as a result of immigration is strongly centered in the northern states. So, what was life like for most white Southerners during this time? Much less glamorous than the wealthy planter aristocracy. Most white farmers who owned slaves um, did not own over 100 slaves, would own 2 or 3 or maybe 15 or 20. And most of them would work side by side with their slaves in the fields. They did not, they would work soil that was less sought after. Many were not cotton farmers. These smaller farmers, many of them were self-sufficient farmers. They'd probably resemble much more what we think about like old New England type farms, and very different style of life. They would not communicate or socialize with the wealthier farmers too much. And you think, well, why were these people so involved in protecting slavery later on? And the real reason, as your book points out, is the idea that they might someday be able to acquire more slaves, that they might someday be able to be one of the wealthier farmers. So they had this capitalistic idea of the potential growth that they could achieve from being a small farm with a few slaves to a massive plantation with over 100 slaves. When you got below the slave owning white farmers who owned smaller farms, then you had the non-slave holding whites who were sometimes, the idea of poor white trash comes in, and these individuals labored for wages that were so low and conditions that were so bad that, realistically, being in a slave position of having some kind of food to eat every day, some kind of shelter every day, might have actually been better than what many of these very poor white Southerners experienced, although clearly they wouldn't trade their freedom, as I'm sure that slaves at the time would have traded their better living conditions for the opportunity to be free and advance themselves. They really held on to the one idea that we were talking about the poor white Southerners, that they were socially higher in society than the slaves, and here you have that sense of discrimination, a sense of racism, prejudice that they are better, that they are socially better than their African American counterparts who are enslaved. There were some groups, and one of your book describes them as the mountain whites in the Appalachians, in the Virginia area especially. These individuals never intermingled with the Southern aristocracy. They resented them in many ways. They were always separated, and when it came to the Civil War, they will side with the Union, and they'll be very important to the Union's cause come that time. So not every white Southerner was a supporter of the aristocracy or the institution of slavery. And this gives you a chart of how many people actually, owned slaves, and you can see that a very small number owned over 100 slaves. And it just gives you an idea of how much of the wealth was concentrated in such few, how much of the wealth was concentrated in such few individuals' hands. Okay, so there were free blacks in the South, believe it or not. Not too many, but many were sons or daughters of their former slave masters, owners. They did own property. They were not allowed to vote. They did face heavy discrimination. There were communities in different places, New Orleans especially popular. They would sometimes have to deal with the possibility of an aggressive slave hunter uh, capturing them and selling them back into slavery. So life was not necessarily good for them, even though they were free, but they did have their freedom. Someone say, well, how did they purchase their freedom? That's always a common question I get. How did they purchase their freedom if they were slaves and not being paid? Remember that slaves lived in communities where they had shifts, like, they just weren't paid for those shifts. Well, when those shifts ended, it wasn't usually like the slaves were locked into their quarters and not allowed out. If a slave wanted to, he or she could conceivably go out into the town and make arrangements to find work where they could be paid. Some slave owners were more lenient than others when it came to this type of arrangement, but those who were able to do that were able to save their money and purchase their freedom. In order to do that, though, they would have had to have a more liberal-minded, lenient slave owner who just didn't take their money from them or rent them out, uh, as opposed to allowing them to save their money. In the North, many think that life was better for free blacks, but in fact, it was not. The fear that many Northerners held, white Northerners held, when it came to slaves or freed slaves, were, when you think about the Irish, they feared job competition. The jobs that the Irish were allowed to apply for and attain were the same types of jobs that freed slaves would want. In many cases, slaves were not allowed into certain states, and the tolerance level was even lower in the North for these individuals than it would have been in the South. So, slavery in the early 1800s, Congress outlaws by 1808 the importation of slaves, although it still happened illegally all the time. And whenever these slave traders were captured, for the most part, Southern courts would acquit them. They wouldn't face, impartial judges. Britain, when it abolished the slave trade in 1807, was extremely important. You see, the West African Squadron, they captured thousands and thousands of they freed thousands and thousands of slaves as a result of their efforts along the Barbary Coast, and certainly many slaves owe their lives to that group. But it was still impossible to stop all of them, and slavery and the trade of slaves still flourished. You see here, 3 million enslaved Africans were shipped to Brazil and the West Indies after 1807. So, in the United States itself, you see quote unquote black ivory. The value of slaves was growing at a remarkable pace in the 1800s, quadrupling from the early 1800s to the mid 1800s, even more than that. So it's extremely valuable commodity, and the slave trade, even within the United States, became especially harsh but profitable for those involved in it. And you think of in the planters in Virginia who were very involved in selling and trading slaves into the deeper South, as Virginia soil became untenable for a crop like cotton, and clearly the need for slaves was not as high. So it made sense for that to occur. You can see here, I just kind of skipped over this, but you also had an increase in slaves in the United States through natural reproduction, encouraged by slave owners. Family life was fairly stable in the deep South, which we're going to talk about in a second. I'm not going to skip ahead on that, but owners treated their slaves. Although you hear obviously the idea that the whip was the motivating force behind labor since they weren't paid. However, owners wanted to avoid that as much as possible because that devalued their slaves. They also would typically not give the slaves the worst of the work. Your book talks about if a roof had to be changed or fixed, why put a slave there? It's too valuable. Hire a poor Irishman to go up there. You better have a wage earner rather than a commodity such as a slave that was so valuable. So breeding, although it was not openly encouraged, it was privately encouraged. The book talks about the idea if a woman had 10 children, a master may grant her her freedom. Many masters father children, um, you know, and you had this growing population of mulattoes as well in the South. The most brutal action that would happen would not be the beatings; it would be the slave auctions, where families would be ripped apart, and then you can imagine a mother with her children and the children being sold separate from her mother, and sometimes separate from their siblings, and a family of 4 or 5 can easily be completely separated for life. As a result of one of these auctions. Harry Beecher Stowe, you know, uh, really writes about this sensitive topic in Uncle Tom's Cabin, and it's a very emotional part of her book and her message. It shows you a slave with probably a ticket number or auction number attached. Okay, so how did slaves live? Again, it nowhere was it good. Uh, Long days, no pay, um, less than human. Uh, Floggings were common, um, but as slaves became more and more valuable, always tried to avoid um, that because it lessened their value. If you were a slave who was strong-willed or rebelled openly, you would be sent to a slave breaker, and that would be exceedingly harsh. In the Black Belt in the Deep South, and this is you see here South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana. This is the really the place of the Southern pioneers. You think of this is a very raw and rough land, untapped part of land. Well, cotton was growing and so fast in this area in the Black Belt, and slavery was too. And as a result, you see here, in many counties, blacks accounted for over 70% of the total population. They lived on huge plantations. They had in this area, very different than in other areas where because of the soil and the smaller farms, slaves were moved more often. The idea of the auction was more common. In these areas, once established, a slave in these areas led a very stable life, many times for generations and generations. So they weren't moved as much, and you could see this where most children would have a two-parent household. We're talking about slaves here. Not that this was a good life, by any means. It's still extremely difficult, extremely harsh conditions. But here, at least, family life was more stable. Also, Southern black culture here flourished, a great deal. You see here where the Africans were the cultural belief they wouldn't marry, in family, which was not a practice by the plant aristocracy in the South. Many times they would marry first cousins and definitely second cousins. Religion. Many African slaves were Christianized. Their churches were different here. You see the responsorial style of preaching, the give and take between college and nations. That's from an African tradition. So when you hear a preacher giving a sermon, that's where it comes from. When the congregation says, at once, "Amen" or something like that, which we've seen ourselves even in the present day. So that's where that comes from. Right, just some pictures, auctions, things like that. This would be a collar with bells if a slave was thought to be a runaway risk. Just illustrates how slaves were very involved in the bringing up of young children. Okay, so how did slaves? Clearly slavery is degrading and it makes people less than human. Slaves just didn't accept this without any type of protest. The most common ways of protest were to slow their pace of work, to slow it to a crawl, just enough that they wouldn't bring in the attention of the taskmaster, but slow enough that they weren't going to push themselves in any way. Um, stealing food or other goods was also a very common practice, which you can understand. And these are things that slave owners dealt with all the time and probably understood that eliminating them altogether was impossible because you're talking about enslaving an entire people. Certainly, they're going to do things to rebel. On a more direct note, there were slave rebellions. This is the worst fear of the South. Remember, I just spoke about counties that were over 75% black. Certainly, if they were organized, they had the capability of causing those southern plantation owners quite a bit of trouble. Most slave rebellions, however, were unsuccessful. There's 1800 Gabriel's plan foiled by informants. Denmark Vesey, same thing. Uh, Ended up being killed. 1822. Nat Turner, they do kill over 60 Virginians, women and children. Made up a lot of those victims, but that's soon extinguished. And laws, as a result of these rebellions, become even tighter on slaves in the South. The Amistad was a really interesting case where Africans illegally imported from Africa were put on a ship. They came from on the Tacora, which is a Portuguese slave ship, brought to the West Indies, traded there, put on the Amistad, which is a ship. Then the Amistad is captured, brought to port, and the whole case ensues. Eventually, the Supreme Court rules in favor of the Amistad Africans, and they are allowed to return to their home in Africa and Sierra Leone. Really interesting is the fact that the lawyer who finally gave, or presented the case to the Supreme Court in the end was John Quincy Adams, former president of the United States. Again, actually, we already mentioned those. Okay, so early abolitionism. Abolitionism, remember, is the movement to end slavery. The American Colonization Society in 1817, the idea is of this society. We talked about the Quakers last chapter, so I'm kind of just skipping there a little bit. But the American Colonization Society, the idea was to create a place for freed slaves to go back in Africa. And this idea was furthered in 1822 with the establishment of the Republic of Liberia, where actually thousands of freed slaves in America would end up going. The problem is, and it's hard to understand. So, well, they're African American slaves. They'd love to go back to Africa. No, they wouldn't. Most were born here in the United States, and even though they were born into slavery, they have culture, they have roots here, and going to a strange place in Africa is as unappealing as it would be for anybody during that time period. Nobody would want to just move to a completely different continent, place they're not familiar with. So it was, for the most part, unsuccessful. Some individuals are early abolitionists. Wilberforce, British Parliament, he's successful in getting laws passed that freed slaves in the West Indies. Theodore Dwight Weld becomes a very wealthy, a very well-known speaker. He is funded by two wealthy abolitionists, New York merchants, Arthur and Lewis Tappan. Lewis Tappan will also be involved in the Amistad case. Let's move on here. You guys can look at some of these maps and pictures later. I'm not going to go through all of them. William Lloyd Garrison, the Liberator. He publishes this pamphlet. It becomes the most widely read abolitionist paper in the country. He is extremely militant in his message. There is no room for interpretation. He believes that slavery is a moral evil. It should end no matter what. He does not believe in just preventing it from expanding to other territories, although his critics say he's becomes too self-involved at certain points because he begins to talk about the North seceding from the evil South. But clearly that would not solve the issue or free the slaves. But he's a very important abolitionist, extremely influential, hated in the South. American Anti-Slavery Society, 1833 is founded. David Walker Uh, important. I'm just skipping through all these. I'm not going to talk about all of them. Sojourner Truth from New York, a freed slave, not only fighting for African American rights but also women's rights. Martin Delaney, he actually did believe in what the American colonization side would have believed in bringing African Americans back to Africa. Frederick Douglass spent some time here. Frederick Douglass is probably the most influential, definitely the most influential black abolitionist of the time, and maybe the most influential abolitionist at the time, period. A slave who escaped bondage at age 21. He is well read. He teaches himself, or gets assistance and teaches himself how to read. Uh, Becomes a phenomenal speaker. He'll write The Narrative of Frederick Douglass, which is his autobiography that tells his entire story. He'll have access to very well known politicians. They're interested in his point of view, including the future president, Abraham Lincoln. So, again, if you want to compare the two, Garrison, stubbornly principled, believed in what he believed in, with no compromise. Douglass cared just as much about the end result, but was much more political and savvy and understood that it had to be a process. And for that reason, Douglass gained more access to important ears during this time. And here you go. I'm not going to go through all these. I'll leave them up here on the screen for a moment so you can take a look. Sojourner Truth, Frederick Douglass. Okay, so how does the South respond to these abolitionists? The South believes these abolitionists, as a whole, are trying to destroy their economy. They believe that slavery is not evil, that it's God's wish. After the Virginia legislature votes against the emancipation proposal, that's probably the last time that is the last time that any state in the South even harbors the idea. And after this, they actually grow more rigid in their defense of slavery. Nat Turner's rebellion, the nullification crisis, these events are uh, further motivators for Southerners to make sure that their Southern slave codes or laws are strictly enforced. They're also motivators to not allow abolitionist literature to intrude or infiltrate the South, even though most Southern blacks can't read. They believe that many of these pieces of literature and newspapers contain enough pictures and art that they could be interpreted and incite further rebellions. Southerners also launched their own propaganda campaign, claiming that slavery is not so bad in the South, that slaves are given food, a place to live, that they're rescued from the jungles and the forests of Africa and given a better life. They argue that slaves actually were treated better than northern factory workers. They give examples of children who worked in factories, stunted growth, injuries, and death, all done in the northern factories for salaries that could not sustain a normal family. Decent points, but certainly no defense for slavery. Politically, Southern politicians successfully passed the gag resolution, which for 8 years until John Quincy Adams successfully had it removed, prevented any law from being proposed that dealt with the abolition of slavery. You guys can go through these pictures on your own in the book. Okay, so how about abolitionists in the North? Were they heroes? Were they loved? Absolutely not. They were considered troublemakers. Garrison nearly escapes death, is threatened all the time, uh, faces physical violence quite a bit. Frederick Douglass is threatened, constantly. Uh, the idea that the abolition of slavery was a widely held motive for all Northerners was wrong. Northerners looked at slavery, or the ending of slavery, the abolition of slavery, as being potentially devastating on the Northern economy. If the Southern plantation owners were not able to produce cotton at a reasonable rate and had to raise those rates, then the textile mills in the North could possibly close. Textile mills in the North closed, then unemployment would grow and Northerners would suffer. So there was not a huge move, at least in the early abolitionist period, towards the ending of slavery, although eventually it's going to shift more and more. The abolitionist movement becomes politicized as we get into the 1840s, 1850s with the creation of new parties, including the Free Soil Party. But it's really important to remember that during this time, if you were a politician and you aligned yourself with, sorry guys, hold on one second. Melissa, you gotta get the door. If politicians, sorry about that, guys. If politicians align themselves with the abolitionist movement, sorry guys, hold on a second. Sorry about that again. If Northern politicians align themselves with Free Soilers, they are going to be basically unelectable. The reason being obvious. If any politician runs on a platform that the general public believes will lead to economic distress or war or things like that, they're not electable. So politicians had to be careful, but as time goes on and we go to the next chapter, you're going to see more and more politicians willing to get involved in abolitionism, and you're going to see the Free Soil Party, eventually the Republican Party, formed, both aimed at abolishing slavery, at least preventing slavery from advancing into the western states. So, hope that works for you guys. See you for chapter 17.